So now we're moving on to our needles and pins portion of the module. And in the sewing book on page 22, you'll see a variety of needles and pins that we have available. Keeping in the spirit of the course, I'm just going to focus on those that are used in dressmaking. So first, we're going to focus on sharps. And these, again, are just the standard needles that you would use. They're general purpose, and they go into different kinds of fabrics. I focus on a lot of fine fabrics, satin, silks, chiffons, so they easily go through the fabrics. You want to be careful that you're not getting very thick ones, especially if you intend to focus on finer fabrics, because as you'll see as we go on, and I explain a little bit further, if you're using the wrong pins, it can damage the fabric. So moving on. I also use the beading needle, and it's a longer needle. It's much longer than the sort of standard needles you would use. And it's used because it more easily goes with beading. So normally, a normal size needle, you would not be able to thread this bead through because it would sort of get stuck right there and it wouldn't go all the way through. But with the beading needle, you'll see that the beads more easily go without getting stuck. And I just have a piece of invisible thread there for you to sort of see that it's a lot easier to thread and bead when you have this specific needle. So there you go. And again, that's just invisible thread, what is often used when doing any kind of bead work. Okay. So those are the two main needles that I use when I'm doing my sewing and my hand sewing. They have several other types. I don't, again, in the spirit of full disclosure, I don't use the self-threading needle. I don't use the automatic needle threader or the wire needle threader. Not for any particular reason, just because right now I'm just more comfortable and it's a lot easier for me to just navigate just direct threading. I'm sure over time I might need to become more accustomed with the wire or the automatic. I'm pretty sure it's going to change my life when I do, but right now I'm just like ready to get to work. So I'm like, all right, this is how I thread my needles. But again, never close your mind off to the possibility of making your sewing easier for yourself. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the pin portion. And again, I'm just going to focus on the pins that I use in dressmaking. So first we have the dressmaker or the straight pins. And these pins are usually shorter, general purpose needles, not anything too crazy. I don't recommend them for finer material or finer fabrics. Why? Well, several things. Usually they're going to be very difficult to get through the fabric, especially if you're talking about satin. If you try to put them through silk, they're going to leave a needle mark or a hole inside the silk. Silk is very temperamental that way. It's not going to tolerate these normal straight pins inside of the fabric, and it's going to be quite difficult to pin and use these needles. So they're good for cottons and just general purpose fabrics. I don't use quilting needles because I do not quilt. So we're going to move on to the pearl head. And as you can see, they're called pearl head because they have this sort of pearl finish. So some disclaimers, definitely don't iron over these because you're going to run into some trouble. So you're not supposed to iron over actually any pins, but as you get more comfortable, you might be breaking a couple of rules. Just like when you start to learn how to drive at first, you're 10 and 2, and then the next thing you know, you're like one-handing it. Kind of the same thing with sewing. There's definitely rules that you should follow. And some of those rules you're going to be like, oh, I should have listened. You're not supposed to sew in your sewing machine with pins. You're probably going to do that when you become more comfortable. But again, you shouldn't iron with pins inside of your garment because you don't want that to melt onto the garment. That's a disaster. I often use the pearl head pins and any pins with sort of a pearl top with a like ball top, especially when I'm doing my appliques and my lace, because it allows you to, as you're pinning, as we'll get when we get into that lesson and doing our applique pinning, it's easier for you to remove these. Whereas if you use regular pins, especially if you're working with very glittery fabrics or like high gloss sequins, what'll happen is you won't be able to see as effectively and take them out. So if you're doing this for yourself or a client, you don't want them to get pricked with a stray pin. So I use these because it's easier to see and navigate and take them out, especially when you're doing applique. Okay, so then we have these lace, and if you notice, when I buy my pins, I always try to get these little plastic cases, and it's just a way to store them. And I also like to put the name of what the pins is. Like, they have the name on the actual packaging, but once you take the packaging off, you're like, I don't remember. Especially because as you can see with the satin and the dressmaker and the long pins, if without the tops, you have no idea. They look exactly the same. You wouldn't notice until you're actually starting to use them, and like, these feel a little odd. So again, I use just these plastic coverings, and I try to label it with a permanent marker. And here we have the silk pin. I love pins. I love these silk fine pins. Again, I do a lot of special occasions, and I need to just buy these like by the busload because they're so easy to use. They go into most fabrics, they slip right in, they come back out, and they don't leave any indentations, which is why they're excellent for special occasion fabrics and excellent for silk, because again, silk has a tendency, once you place that pin inside of it, it leaves a terrible hole in it. And again, even when you're sewing on the sewing machine, once that hole is there, there is no ironing out of it. That hole is there forever, and it can damage the look of it. So it often requires you to cut out a full brand new piece of the material or of the pattern, and silk is not cheap. So you want to make sure you're using the right material so that you don't find yourself spending more money on having to replace certain things. So that's why it's important to label your pins and make sure you're using the appropriate pins for the project you're doing. Same thing here. I have my satin pins, and these are a little bit shorter, and you can easily confuse them with the dressmaking pins because they're shorter and they look almost identical until you're trying to actually place them into satin, and you'll realize that it goes smoother into satin than maybe the dressmaker pins would go. But again, if you just wanted to focus, if you're doing special occasions and you just wanted to focus on just generally having an even way to do this, then I would definitely say use these type of pins. Okay, then we go to the glass head pins, and I use these for a number of projects. When I'm hemming a dress, they're easy to sort of mark out the hems, and different kinds of projects where you just wanted to use these, and they're easier to pick up. So that's a huge thing. These the other types of pins, you don't see, they don't have that ball on the top of it, so you'll find yourself like grasping quite a lot to pick it up, and that can be frustrating. So having, again, this metallic pickup definitely helps you sort of like run it along the floor and pick these up, so it's easier to pick up. So I definitely, again, recommend getting this magnetic wristlet. Okay, next we're gonna go on to long pins. And again, some of these that I'm going over, you may or may not see here. Some of them I use them because over time, it's just something I've become more comfortable with. You may just want to go out and get exactly. What I enjoy about this book is it gives you a brief breakdown of each item, very vivid pictures and what they're used for. So it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. Again, I'm focusing mostly on dressmaking, so these are the pins that I often use. So now you have the long pins. And again, I enjoy these because they are longer, they're easier to pick up, they go through fabric more easily than the shorter dressmaking pins that I have over there. So I enjoy these, like I said. They're great for if you're just starting out sewing and you're just getting used to using pins. I would say definitely go for the long dressmaker pins because, again, they're easier to work with, they're easier to pick up, and it just allows you to get more comfortable with them as time goes on. Okay, again, we go back to the safety pins. And these are just great when you're trying to, and you get the packs going, there's different sizes. And these are just great when you're trying to bring together more than one piece of fabric securely so that it doesn't come out as maybe it would if you were using a stray pin, which only has one closed end at the other side. So it's basically open on one side. So then you're running into probably pricking yourself or your client if you're trying to pin something on them. And then you have down here the staple and the spiral. I don't use those. Those are more for upholstery and those heavier projects. If that's what you're interested in doing, then I definitely suggest you getting those in addition to this book. And of course, lastly, pin cushions are perfect. You kind of stick your straight pins and needles inside of there. I don't use mine as often for pins because I have these little boxes as much as I use them for like my stray needles that I don't have a box for, I'm not ready to put away, or I just want easier access to it when I am sewing. So that is it for our needles and pins lesson. Okay. Now we have our threads portion of the lesson. And again, just to kind of keep repeating what the focus of this course is a dressmaking focus course. So a lot of the things I'm going to be gearing you towards is the things that I use for my dressmaking. However, I encourage you again to purchase the sewing book as well as the dressmaking book so that you can decide what you need for each project. These are great referencing books. I mean, I bought them several years ago and they still apply a lot today. Okay, so here you'll see the various kinds of threads that are used in sewing. And for those of you who are more being introduced to sewing, who thought you can sew with any thread, unfortunately, I have news for you. You cannot. There are specific threads that you need that go along and coincide with specific fabrics. And that is a very key point when you're doing your sewing, is there are specific tools and things that go with each project. So a lot of times I have clients or people asking me, oh, can you sew this? Can you sew this? Can you sew this? With the assumption that because I can sew absolutely anything. I'm sure I could learn to sew, but the tools that I have acquired are very focused for sewing a specific kind of thing. And that's why I try to sort of like convey to them, like, although I probably could, I've accumulated the tools that are best for this particular kind of sewing. And it's not something I want to venture into. So if you ever need an excuse as to why you didn't want to sew a thing, just tell them that's not the kind of materials that I've accumulated over time. Maybe that'll stop them. Probably not. Okay, let's move right into it. So we have the cotton thread as your first example. And as you can see, this thread is a little bit thicker. What I love about the book is that the pictures are so vibrant and you can almost see the texture within the pictures, which is quite, beneficial, especially when you're doing like fabrics and threads. There's no guesswork with these flat pictures. The pictures are very vivid and almost precise. But I do have an example here, and the cotton thread is just a little bit thicker, a little bit more coarse than other threads, and it's a little bit more obvious how much thicker it is as opposed to some of the other threads we're going to be looking at. So that's a cotton thread, and you use that with standard general purpose sewing, cotton fabrics. It's easy to use. It's just a little bit thicker. Okay, you also have the buttonhole fabric, and I don't have that. When I do buttonholes, they're often, I use a silky satin fabric, or I use hand sewing for buttons, just because it's kind of garments that I sew are a little bit more higher end, and I don't use a standard sort of buttonhole fabric, but you can use that, and it's just a thicker kind of fabric to create that button outline. I also have here the polyester all-purpose thread, and that's it right here. And it's just your, is it on top here, all-purpose? And it's just your standard thread. As you can see, if you can see, it's a little finer than the cotton. So here's the cotton, and here is the all-purpose polyester, and it's just a little bit finer than this one. I mainly use for my projects this kind of thread. Okay, so now we have some other threads. We have the silk thread, elastic thread, and again, we're going back to the serger thread. These are usually, for me, a lot longer because they're going to sit on the serger machine, and they just need to be a lot longer. I like to use these only because there's so much more of it. And it's just sheer laziness. It's just so much more of it, and it doesn't require me to constantly have to go to the fabric store and replenish it. But you should be using the proper thread with the proper project that you're doing. This gets the job done. It's general purpose, and it basically goes across many different kinds of sewing projects. But if there's a more specific one, then you have to sort of like change up your thread. I use this mostly across the board though. Unless I'm going into different projects where it is required that I change up the thread. For example, if I was doing something more towards embroidery, this serger thread would not be the thread that I use. Okay. Embroidery, you would focus more on these shiny types of threads. And again, it's because it's supposed to be more decorative. You're supposed to have like more vibrant, vivid colors. So you want that shine and you want that sheen to it because you're, like I said, you're dealing with something that is supposed to be more decorative. So here they give you some examples of the different types of embroidery threads. And lastly, you can focus on the metallic threads. I love metallic threads, but as you can see, they are a bear because first of all, the types of needles you use with this, whether it's in a sewing machine or whether it's hand sewing, they're different needles because the eye of those needles is usually a bit larger, and that's almost assuredly because this tangles so very easily. As pretty as it is as hard as it is to sew with. I've often used it for like decorative hand sewing. I've used it or attempted to use it in a serger because it actually creates really pretty hemlines if you just take about 4 spools of these together and run it through your serger. I'll show you an example of that, and it creates really pretty hemlines. However, it is not easy to deal with. I would not recommend, if you're in the beginning stages of sewing, I would not recommend you touch this for a little while because it can be very frustrating to use. But once you get the hang of it, it makes really beautiful decorative pieces that add a lot of accent to a garment. I know I said lastly for that, but I also wanted to touch on 2 other kinds of sort of metallic-ish threads, but one that I use more commonly with the kind of work that I do on special occasions, and that's these invisible threads. And I have the clear and then I have the black. And these kind of have a similar texture to the metallic thread. It has this sort of wiry texture, very thin. This one almost feels like hair. And it's very wiry, has a nice pull to it. You might hear the squeaking that it does. And I use this when I'm beading or doing any kind of lace work with dark garments. So if I'm doing black lace, if I'm doing black beading, or any dark sort of, maybe even this color dress, because when you're putting the beading on there, if you use this color, it's almost going to come off as white. So I had to pick up this one so that it was a little bit darker so that you couldn't see the beading or the hand sewing that you were doing. So this I would use for darker fabrics if I was doing beading or lace. This invisible thread, I often use it for bridal, and it goes across the board. It can be used with lace. And again, it has this plasticky, squeaky sound to it. And it's supposed to be essentially invisible. Maybe you can see a bit of the light hitting it, but it's supposed to be invisible. You use it in beading, lace, a lot of higher end sewing, special occasions garments, a lot of beading, handwork, those kinds of things, because you don't want to show where it's almost supposed to look like this illusion of just like the way things are sitting on a particular garment. So when you use other types of thread, it's obvious and it doesn't look as nice and as professional as it would if you use the invisible thread. So this is something I use quite a lot in the kind of work that I do. So that's pretty much an overview of the kinds of threads that you can use for your sewing. There was some here that I cover quite extensively and some that you can actually go back within the book and see exactly what they can be used for. But these are some of the main ones that I use in the kind of sewing that I do. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Videos are uploaded weekly covering dressmaking, fashion, lectures, and more.